1 second to close the door behind me so the light is not as disruptive.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, that should look better. Okay,
It's
let me
perfect.
try and share my screen. My apologies for the delay. My slides are not showing up under the shareable windows. My apologies. I'll try this one more time. If it doesn't work, I'll just speak.
Also, you can try to put it in the chat if you can't identify the window, and we will try to project them in here and then share our screen so that the others can
Oh,
as well.
excellent. Okay, let me see.
Did you share it?
I am trying to. My apologies. I don't know what is happening. Ah, here we go. Excellent. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, perfect. Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. If I change slides, are the slides changing?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Then I will get to it. Let me just put a timer on. Okay, thank you firstly and foremostly for this wonderful opportunity. I am grateful to be able to talk to everybody today. I've presented at conferences about psychedelics before, but this would be the first time I'm at a dedicated conference for psychedelics, which is a rather profound experience that I am grateful for. That being said, let's get into it. So today I will be presenting on the idea of an activist framework for understanding psychedelic transformation in therapy, specifically as opposed to a representationalist or representationalist theories. So as the current slide indicates, the current dominant models, which is mainly derivative of the Rebus model, are grounded in representationalism, and I am to propose an activist framework that is grounded in phenomenology, embodied cognition, and dynamic systems theory that reframes the transformation that takes part during psychedelic experiences, not as exclusively neurological, but instead as a systemic reconfiguration of being in the world. So to do this, first we will look at predictive processing as the underpinning model of mind for the Rebus model, and then we'll look briefly at the Rebus model before we make the turn to enactivism. I'm going to do these things rather briefly as there are time constraints. So if there's anything you would like for me to discuss in more depth, please note it for the Q&A. Okay, so first things first then for predictive processing as a theory of mind. This proposes the brain as a prediction machine, or then also sometimes called a error minimization machine, which generates models of the world by anticipating sensory inputs. So what this then does is the brain uses top-down processing essentially to construct models of the world that's utilized to predict future input and sensory signals, and then inconsistencies that may arise in these predictions. If the prediction itself was wrong, they should be addressed either by the model itself being updated or by the source of the conflicting data being addressed. In this sense, then the brain functions essentially as a complex simulation generator for phenomenal consciousness based on prior experience. In other words, whatever you experience is not in fact actual reality. You experience the brain's model of reality. In that sense, then, as Lethaby has noted, conscious experience is presented as a controlled hallucination. And perception arises from this minimization process that happens in creating the model. So over the span then of a lifetime, essentially, the brain creates incredibly complex models that replicate the causal structures of the extracranial world, which creates the essentially believability of phenomenal experience. So for the rebus model itself, this is a merging of two particular theories, the free energy principle and the anthropic brain hypotheses, in which the anthropic brain hypothesis is used to determine the increased randomness, disorderliness, and chaos that's introduced into the brain during a psychedelic experience. And the free energy principle presents a unified depiction of a living, self-producing, maintaining system that has a tendency to minimize uncertainty. So the predictive brain then does this, right? Its entire purpose is to minimize uncertainty so much so that it can get as accurate predictions as possible for overall benefit of the organism, so to speak. This and then the increased brain entropy has been linked specifically to the default mode network and the salience network during the psychedelic experience. And this coupling of these networks, or this integration of these networks, then disrupt supposedly rigid high-level generative models. So models that hypothetically then become stuck in pathology. It's this rigidness of these models that creates the pathology, so to speak. And through the experience then, neurologically, this leads to a loosening of these entrenched beliefs, which allows for therapeutic restructuring. So in this sense, then, therapeutic change happens to be a neurological reset, so to speak. So then a critique of representational models, or then as the head of the slide says, the homunculus in the machine. This comes from Husserl's homunculus problem from phenomenology, in which representational models of mind have the consequence that they invariably separate the brain from its environment, or mind from its environment. And because of this, it causes the regression problem. And the regression problem is that representations, the regressive representations, require a non-representational foundation in order to be confirmed. So reading a quote here then from Husserl, as he says that the ego is then not a tiny man in a box that looks at pictures and then occasionally leaves this box in order to compare the external object, compare it with external objects with the internal one, sorry. For such a picture observing ego, the picture would itself be something external. It would require its own matching internal picture, and so ad infinitum. So it creates this consistent regression where you need confirmation, but the confirmation needs its own confirmation, etc., etc., etc. So in other words, for representation to operate as a representation, we need to assume some non-representational perception. So just put it in a different way, for x to represent y, x needs to be interpreted as a representation of y. And there is no possibility to do this if all you have access to is phenomenal models of reality. This then creates what Sanneke de Haan, following Bernstein here, calls Cartesian anxiety, which means there's no access to external reality, only access to brain-bound models, and there is no possibility to answer the question of how do we confirm that these representations indeed do represent reality. So, as Jacob Howie has said, a consequence of this theory of mind is that it's inferentially secluded and neurocentrically skull-bound. There's no escaping this. So this then presents a risk of reductionism when it comes to therapy, because therapy itself becomes brain-centric, neglecting all possible bodily and environmental causes and interventions of reasons why people might need to go to therapy, such as mental illness. So all mental illness becomes illnesses of the brain, right? Or then it reduces them to bad predictions. So an alternative non-representational model I would then promote is an enactivist model. Enactivism is first and foremostly perceives of cognition as relational, meaning it's not skull-bound. Cognition emerges from the brain-body environment coupling. It is the result of a process, right? Meaning arises then from interaction, not from internal representations. And such an activist approach would emphasize the extended, intersubjective, and socially situated nature of cognitive systems. This is grounded in phenomenology, such as Merleau-Ponty's conception of embodiment, Heidegger's ready to hand, and Gibson's affordances. These are all very similar. If you want to know more about them, ask me in the Q&A. Moving on for time's sake to de Haan's notion of sense-making. So for Sanneke de Haan, in her book Enactive Psychiatry, she presents sense-making as a way to understand A, what an organism is, and how cognition arises from the interaction between an organism and an environment, and how we may use this to understand what can go wrong in sense-making. So first and foremostly, sense-making can be defined as an organism's evaluative interaction with their environment. In other words, because of our dependency on our environment, what we encounter all around us matters to us. Phenomenologically, this will say something about intentionality, but right now it's a matter of affordances, right? So what is the possibilities of your environment will determine how you interact with your environment, which will determine in turn how you make sense of your own being and the being of the world that you are in. In this sense, then, sense-making is relational, it's affective, and it's socially constituted, right? So as de Haan says, the world is inextricably included in our mindedness. So what does this then say for disordered sense-making? So de Haan proposes an activist account of psychiatric disorders that understands them as structurally disturbed patterns of sense-making. So if your field of affordances, those things which are possible to you, the field of possibilities presented by both your environment, yourself, and the relationality between these two nodes of a dynamical system is equally dependent on each other, disordered sense-making would be a altered or constricted field of affordances then. So examples of this would be, I'll give a visual aid in 1 second. Depression will have a particularly dull field of affordances. OCD will have a fixated field, and something like anxiety will have a fear-dominated field. So here is a bit of a visual representation provided by Dahan here. So on average, this is what a field of affordances may be represented as. The various intensities of the different affordances is based on the particular environments, possibilities, and the necessity of the organism itself, right? So for a depressed patient, then affordances are likely to all appear rather dull and at the same level, and nothing is more appealing than anything else or more threatening necessarily than anything else. It's just all remarkably devoid of joy. Where for an OCD patient, perhaps you have the obsession itself that is blocking all other affordances, as this is the immediacy of what needs to be addressed right now. So how this relates to dynamic systems theory then? Dynamic system theory proposes that change at any node of the system, so any point where the system connects to another point, would affect the entirety of the system as a whole, right? So for the psychedelic experience then, within the context of therapy, this will alter the organism-world relationality. And I argue that it will allow for an expansion of the field of affordances. In other words, it would, during the psychedelic experience, one has much more possibility. The environment itself and your relationality to it affords you much more. This enables new sense-making patterns. And what is incredibly important here then for treatment, for psychedelic-assisted therapy, is that intervention for treatment is not neurologically limited. It is not only brain bound. It can happen at any node of the system. So intervention can then happen neurologically, environmentally, or relationally. So psychedelics in that sense arguably can reset sense-making patterns via affordance expansion. So just to expand a bit more on this reframing of psychedelic transformation through enactivism, psychedelics firstly can reconfigure how one relates to the world. I would say during and post experience, this is then not just a neuropharmacological reset, it's a existential reorientation. So an altered state creates altered affordance fields, which leads to new ways of being in the world. As Sean Gallagher has noted, that the nature of such a system, of a dynamical system of cognition, depends on the instantiation of certain dynamical couplings. And if any of these couplings are altered, the entirety of the organism or the system is then altered. So the psychedelic experience changes this coupling, which changes cognition, which in turn changes sense making. Because sense making is then dynamic, context sensitive, and socially learned, psychedelics create opportunities where new affordances become visible, habitual patterns can be interpreted, and relationality can be restructured. Then to compare this to representational models, for cognition, the representational models rely on internal modeling, where an activist on their relational model is a relational process. The focus is for representational models brain-centric, where for enactive models they are systemic, so i.e. the entire body-brain environment or world-person relation. And then specifically for psychedelic-assisted therapy, representational models rely on a neurological reset, wherein an activist model would rely on a relational reconfiguration. To conclude then, in activism, avoids the representational regress, so the homunculus problem, as it does not separate the brain and its environment. It's all one system. This accounts for social, embodied, and existential aspects of being. It opens therapy to diverse interventions. In other words, treatment isn't putting all of its eggs in one neurological basket. And psychedelics can be seen as tools for reconfiguring sense making and broadening the fields of affordances for a particular organism. In activism, then reframe psychedelic therapy not as a exclusive intervention into the brain, but as a reconfiguration of the person-world system, opening up the space for new forms of sense making and existential orientation. Thank you.
We thank you too. It was a very, very great talk. We have some questions from the room. So if you
Great. Thanks so much for your talk. There's going to be a somewhat dilemmatic question. Ordinarily, transformative experiences, sort of Laurie Paul style, are, I believe, cashed out in representationalist terms. So, for instance, the inability to, well, I shouldn't say the inability, the lack of warrant, right, for when we imaginatively anticipate what happens following a transformative experience, right? And so I was just wondering what you mean when you say psychedelic transformation, because it might be the case that an enactive perspective fits psychedelic experiences and the altered states of consciousness that accompany them, etc. But it's not clear to me how that characterizes transformation in the sort of in the sense in which other experiences get to count as transformative, right? Motherhood, some limit situation, being taken hostage, etc. And so when you say psychedelic transformation, do you consider psychedelic experiences as transformative in that classical sense, or do you think that sense should be abandoned and we should reconceive of transformative experiences in an enactive way completely? So just, to take an example, Kierkegaard, right, thought of coming to faith as a transformative experience. Clearly, psychedelic experiences are not necessarily like that, right? And so could you just speculate a bit on how your take on psychedelic experiences relates to the transformative experiences literature? Thanks so much.
Excellent, not a problem. So both the other experiences that you mentioned, it was motherhood and another one I can't remember exactly.
being taken as hostage.
Yes, being taken as hostage, radically alter the dynamical coupling of the system with its environment, right? Of the organism with its environment. So let's take being taken hostage for argument's sake. You are forcefully removed from one space, you are under immediate threat, and you are forced into another space, which is also a threatening space. This radically alters how you relate then to your environment. And these circumstances, the relational aspect of your environment will be one of fear. Similarly to this, I think the psychedelic experience radically alters the relation between the organism and its environment. So between the experiential individual and how they relate to the world that they're in. During the experience itself, so amidst full-on phenomenology of the experience, you engage profound things that quote unquote normal waking consciousness does not allow the organism, right? So that will inherently mean that the coupling between the environment and the individual is already radically different. And just because that coupling is different, the system will inevitably change. So there is no real difference in a conception of transformation between, let's say, a threatening experience like being taken hostage and an experience like a psychedelic experience. So no, I don't think we need to reconceive of what transformation itself is. I just think that transformation for psychedelics is not that difficult of a thing. It feels almost obvious in a way because you are radically altering the way the organism relates to its environment. So the entirety of the system will change.
You can answer? Thank you. Thank you. Yes?
Hi. Congrats
Hi,
for this talk. I just
thank
have
you.
a very quick question. So the inactive approach usually includes this emphasis on the multiple interdependencies between the organism and multiple layers of the environment, right? So I was wondering what role does the social and cultural aspects of the environment play? Because if you have a person who uh, has been living in an environment that considers psychedelic experiences as not epistemically transformative in some sense. Once they have the experience, they would acquire such and such beliefs that would seem to contrast with what they used to believe as being part of the social and cultural environment. So I was wondering what your thoughts on this are.
Yes, so this would be a alteration to sense making, right? So if
Right.
we take sense making as the way we evaluate our environment, we have to understand that sense making is also socially, culturally informed, right? So if we take the example of a person that perhaps did not conceive of the psychedelic experience of having any epistemic value, they have the experience, and then post experience they now do think there's some epistemic value based on now their prior experience. This would be the result of exactly the type of thing I'm talking about, where their sense making has been altered, and because their sense making has been altered, their conception of what psychedelics allows has been altered. So this does require that in the prior to the experience, socially, culturally, they have a particular conception for the change to be possible, of course. But yes, I think that it's just a matter of new sense making that's made possible through the experience.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have another question?
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, okay. Hi.
Betty.
Hi. It's very, very nice to hear DST from time to time coming back to life. So I'm sorry. Yeah. So in some sense, my question would be to come back to this idea of the DST as being actually a mathematical formalism for perception and learning and actually cognition. But they would like to hear, once you put the inactivism into the picture, people like Van Gelder and the others, to see how hard it is or how easy it is to mathematize, bring this concept of social environment into the original framework of attractors and periods and everything that works so nicely when it comes to perception, the olfactive system and the visual system. They may have troubles, or I'm thinking about the original, the orthodoxy of DST, to see how you integrate this in the original mathematical idea of stability, macro variables producing from micro some subspaces and dimensional reduction, all this type of beautiful solutions that they found, especially for the olfactory system. But how do you bring the social and the body, the enactment of the body into the image of the original mathematical idea that actually worked pretty well for a while? So that's my...
Excellent, thank you. I would say, well, let me just firstly say that my understanding of the original, as you call it, orthodox understanding of dynamical system theory is perhaps not the best, but what I would say is that I would say it's affordance based. So it's based on what the environment affords the particular individual. So what one node of the system affords a different node relationally, and how this accounts for the environment. So is or for the social aspects of the environment is because this is the type of beings individuals or humans are, right? We are socially and culturally constituted. So our environment is constituted in the same way. The same thing goes for embodiment. Without the body itself, there is no way for the organism to have access to other parts of the system. But for the system to be a system, to be dynamical, each of the nodes need to have access to each other. And this is what embodiment allows. Embodiment is quite literally the platform through which the environment and the organism, or then the person, interacts with each other. And it's this interaction, it's this process that for enactivism creates cognition. I hope that is somewhat of an answer, but yes, I am not a philosopher of mathematics. I am a philosopher of mind.
Great, thank you. Yes, can you come? One more question, please.
Excellent, thank you.
Hi, Werner. Two questions for you.
Yes.
One simple and the other one, we'll see how that is. The simple one is this being attempted anywhere? Is this being applied or implemented? This is one. So in considering both the complexity of what we're taking into account when we're talking enactivism and all the other factors, and that it cannot be like isolated in a box, plus the delicacy of undergoing psychedelic studies. So that's one. And two, looking at a systems view, it strikes me that it is necessary or at least beneficial to adopt an even higher level view where the system is not, let's say, the patient undergoing the respective intervention or study, but the actual system itself when we're talking social environment and so on. And in that case, how do we even define that? Because it seems like taking that out of the context, we can define the individual going through therapy, yes, psychedelic or not. But then what are we even looking at in terms of what that individual is a part of, systemically speaking? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for both those questions. For firstly, the applicability, if it's being applied anywhere, as a model specifically for psychedelic assisted therapy, I'm going to say no. I'm going to say that in my reading, I have not come across where this is practically being applied in how one conceives of a model for therapeutic intervention. However, just enactive psychiatry is actively being practiced, and this is based on the philosopher of psychiatry, Sanneke de Haan's work. I believe she's perhaps located somewhere in the Netherlands, but she does practical philosophy as well, where these kinds of theoretical things are reworked into testable empirical hypotheses. And then these are hopefully eventually integrated into actual practice. But there is more, so to speak, holistic psychiatric models out there that does not reduce mental illness merely to neurological function or then dysfunction. As for a broader systems view, I am on the same page with you. I think if we ought to completely and utterly address what is actually at stake, we ought to address the entire treatment system, so to speak, for the lack of a better word, the entire medical system in a way. But what makes a organism approach as a starting point attractive is this is the starting point of all human cognition, right? It is the individual, but not the individual by itself. It's the individual within their community, within their broader social sense, within relation to other organisms, etc., within one layer of the system that then makes a societal layer of the system, that then makes a global layer of the system, etc., etc. So in that way, it's kind of like Whiteheadian. It's kind of process philosophy in a way, but in a way that allows for intervention at various levels. So if we were to address, for argument's sake, something like generational trauma that is a byproduct of a real systemic issue like racism or a previous oppressive regime or something, then you will need to both address the individual forms of trauma, but also the structural forms of trauma. So to start creating beneficial feedback loops between the various nodes of the system for there to be wide enough change. So in that aspect, yes, I agree with you that we need to take an even broader view, and the broader the view it gets, invariably the more complex it becomes, and then its complexity beyond upon complexity upon complexity, which requires a lot of work. Yeah.
Yes. Did he answer?
Yes, very much so.
Thank you. Thank you. So just to wrap it up, I would say that as Heidegger said, we are thrown into the world, and we have to face this quotidianity of existence. Maybe psychedelics could take us out from that impersonal world of design, the others who dictate for us, and we could reframe our own existence or structure, inner structure. Wonderful. Thank you, Werner.
Thank
We
you
really
very much.
appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, everybody. Thank you.
And now